All right, good morning. Hello, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're based, and welcome to today's virtual event, our new disrupted reality, the future of internet infrastructure, hosted by ServerFarm and NYI. I'm Amy Chovanec with JSA, and I'm happy to kick off today's virtual event. For the next hour, this Q&A and networking event will reflect on the evolution of critical infrastructure throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and the best way to move forward as a community. Your attendance today will also help two different nonprofits create pathways to economic prosperity. ServerFarm and NYI are donating $10 per attendee for the first 100 people attending today to Empower, an organization that launches digital careers for military veterans and young adults from underserved communities, and Young Women's Trust, which helps achieve economic justice for young women. We are honored to have fantastic speakers from NYI and ServerFarm driving this conversation today. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes to share. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, feel free to type them into the Q&A section located at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to get to them by the end of the hour. Feel free to add any comments to the comment box on your screen as well. If we don't have time to get to your questions, we invite you to join us for our LinkedIn post-event discussion at the top of next hour. We will be happy to address any outstanding questions there. I will be posting the link right in the chat box for you as well, so you can find where that post-event LinkedIn discussion will be. Our speakers will be joining us as well to answer any questions that you have, so just be on the lookout for that. Okay, so let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's virtual event, JSA's very own Dean Perrine. Dean brings more than 20 years of telecom industry strategy, analysis, and marketing PR experience to today's discussion. Welcome, Dean.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you for noting that it has been 20 years. I really appreciate that. I am glad to be here and glad to be with my old friend, Phillip Koblence, and my new friend Arun. But over the past few months, we've seen organizations of all types and sizes having to pivot both strategically and kind of operationally quickly due to the coronavirus pandemic. Seemingly in concert, there's been an accelerating digital transformation timelines and shifting business models, many people being forced into mission-critical IT roles in their own homes. So what's happening? So the connectivity industry has stepped up and into the spotlight, with the world recognizing the critical nature of our internet infrastructure, how we're coming to you today, and how it permeates essentially every aspect of our lives: work, school, streaming, virtual workouts, music lessons, all sorts of things. So to talk about the victories and some of the challenges of kind of our new disrupted reality, that each one of us are facing quite literally every day. We have Mr. Arun Shenoy. Arun is the SVP of Sales and Marketing at ServerFarm, and Mr. Phillip Koblence. Phillip is the co-founder and COO at NYI. Guys, good morning, good afternoon, as it were. Arun, let's go ahead and jump right into things. Now, before you guys speak, we're going to go ahead and before you guys get a word in, I'm going to tell you to be quiet. We're gonna go ahead and start off with a couple of polls to kind of get the conversation moving along. Our first poll, which is now right up in front of me. How have your working hours shifted as a result of the pandemic? Not at all. I'm working far more. I'm working a bit more. I'm working far less. I'm working a bit less. So if you all could just take a couple of seconds and fill in the answers there, that would be great. Phillip, Arun, any thoughts on our first poll question?
Sure. First of all, happy to be here. Thanks, Dean. Arun, always a pleasure. Everyone else, thanks for attending. Look, I think in the internet world, especially when you're starting your own company, we've been on a 24-hour cycle since day one for the last 24 years. I think now it's become more acute to everyone, where we're working 24 hours a day, and everyone, I mean, look behind me, everyone's sleeping in the office, as it were. So, it's just kind of finding the balance between, being present for your family and trying to find, the effective windows to work and having everyone in the same house is challenging, especially in Brooklyn, where I don't have the grandiose background that Arun has across the pond.
Thanks, Arun. How about your thoughts?
This is a virtual background, obviously. So just so we're 100% clear.
And nobody would buy those artichokes.
Who would? Well, my wife. So let's not tell her. That'll go down very badly. So yeah, let me echo Phil's words as well. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I think, yes, we are in an industry that by definition is kind of always on. And I think it's certainly true that our working practices have changed. And there's a mix, depending on the role of the individual. Some of us are certainly doing more in terms of attending more meetings, taking more calls. Others have a slightly different impact in the sense that they might be doing the same sort of volume of work, but doing it in a different environment. Like Phil said, suddenly our homes and our offices have kind of become the same thing. Many of us have probably seen that little sort of viral video clip of a few years ago when the sort of South Korea expert was being interviewed by the BBC and his children came storming into the room. I mean, that wouldn't go viral anymore, right? That's just every day. So lots has changed. I think on the whole for the better. I think we've been forced to address some things that perhaps we haven't considered before. And clearly we'll get into that conversation here, but I think there's certainly positive change, but there are certainly some challenges as well. Mental health issues and stress and and over workload and homeschooling. I mean, lots of us. Fortunately, I have older children, so I don't have that particular worry. But people with younger children have to both work and be teachers at the same time, and that's pretty tough.
It's difficult. Look, I think that's the biggest thing, right? The trying to find that balance, because you can so quickly kind of burn yourself out when you're just available all the time, and people take for granted people that you work with, whether they be within your organization or clients or vendors or whatever, just take for granted the fact that you can't say that I'm traveling this week or I'm not around. Vacation kind of ceases to have meaning, other than a kind of self-imposed hiatus from being connected. And it's an issue that I think, I've heard a lot of associates of mine suggest that they weren't aware of how challenging their home life was because they were traveling so much, and it provided this new level of awareness of what their families were going through when they weren't there. But if they hide away in their office for 23 to 24 hours a day, they're kind of doing this. It's almost worse because they're there but not available. So you have to kind of carve out time to make yourself available for your family in a way that I think the separation between being at the office or traveling for work or whatever and being at home just didn't have that challenge.
Absolutely. Amy, here we go. The results from the poll: 29% saying not at all, 17% saying working far less, 38% saying I'm working a bit more. That's actually was my response, a bit more. 4% working far less, and 13% I'm working a bit less. Is that surprising to you guys?
I think the disparity is surprising. You kind of figure that people take those poll numbers and they'll say, I'm working more or I'm working less. It's interesting to see kind of the nuance of it all. But look, I think there's a combination of things. I think if you don't have to take the time out of your day to commute, and you don't have to take the time out of your day to travel, is that really time spent working in regular times? If we can remember what it was like 5 months ago, because those memories are quickly fading for me. There's a certain efficiency with which we're able to work now, where even if you're not necessarily putting in more specific hours from the time that you left your house and got home, you're actually spending more time working, I think, and it might be some subliminal in some ways.
Arun?
Yeah, and I think there's also just to kind of build on Phil's point, we're absolutely not traveling. Some of us not at all, some of us much less than, again, as I said earlier, it really depends on roles, right? People in operational roles where, you know, we're in an industry where most of our workers are classified as key workers. So they still have to physically be at our locations because that's just the nature of that particular role. But as I said, for those of us that are not traveling, you know, we're sort of filling the time and I think on the whole being probably more efficient. We're certainly more available. And I think that leads to, you know, greater efficiency and kind of, you know, output, if you will. But I think there is also sort of point of diminishing returns, right? You know, just because you do 16 hours doesn't mean you get twice as much done as you did in 8. So I think, and by the way, all of us have a slightly different level, right? Some of us are very good. You know, I tend to have a big dip in the afternoon where some combination of coffee and gin, depending on how we do that. Different conversation. Oh, wrong webinar. But the point is that, you know,
same cup though. Same cup, so nobody can actually tell. Mixing
it in the same one is very good. You know, look, here it is. You know, all nice and anyway. In a clear glass, it just wouldn't look so good. Anyway, different conversation. So the point is that, you know, we all have to try and figure out what that sort of, you know, that kind of formula is for us individually, because yeah, as Phil said, you know, we're all in our homes. And there is an expectation, rightly so, that we are both at home and work. And as you said, Phil, you know, we can't just lock ourselves away for 23 hours and somehow pretend that, you know, we're not here, but here at the same time. So it's become, I think it's become a great opportunity for us to be much more appreciative of, you know, what we have at home and actually how complex running a home is. You know, I'd never really thought about it. You know, if I'd given it half a minute's thought, it's kind of obvious now. You know, but there's a lot more involved.
I don't know if everyone is seeing this. Clearly, Arun is significantly better at running the home, or whoever has run it, than
not
I am.
me. Just so we're 100% sure.
Yeah. Speaking of running things, I'm going to go ahead and move along to the next poll question, if that's all right with you guys. Next question for our attendees: what's been your biggest challenge, professionally speaking, throughout the pandemic? Work-life balance, maintaining productivity. Again, all of this stuff is what we were just talking about. So work-life balance, maintaining productivity, overcoming technical hurdles. Fortunately, we haven't had any of those yet, or something else. Please go ahead and take 20 seconds to answer those. Meantime, Phillip, Arun, thoughts on this question?
Yeah, technical hurdles is a good one, actually. So my 2 sons are under very strict instructions to just lay off, you know, the PlayStation and the Xbox for at least the next hour, which, you know, we've all had to become, right? We've all had to become kind of bandwidth jugglers and you know, quality of service moderators. And actually, you know, it's kind of an interesting challenge for the networking companies, you know, the telcos. They never built consumer broadband to have, you know, the sort of type of quality of service that is really now becoming sort of expected. You know, we're all, you know, we would all like, I mean, I live in a sort of rural part of the UK, and, you know, we're very lucky we have 70 megabits. But I don't get 70 megabits. That is not the performance I get, because guess what? I'm sharing that with, you know, however many other people in the same street. So that, I think, is interesting. So
on top of the people in your own house, I mean, you're sharing it with the kids also, right?
The 2 heaviest users, yeah, absolutely. I'm a pretty casual user when it comes to that kind of thing.
I think it's one of the benefits of being in Brooklyn, and this will be my only Brooklyn plug, is the idea that, you know, there's so much infrastructure in New York City specifically that early on in this process, I actually saw when my kids were still in school and I was, you know, we were trying to do simultaneous Zooms and all that. I actually got my own line just for me with my own sets of IPs, my own router. So that is something that we've had to do. I actually have, you know, redundancy in the home, notwithstanding the cell service. I think I have 4 ways out of my home. So, you know, at least I'm eating my own dog food as far as that goes. But I think there's no question that work-life balance is probably the hardest. I mean, it's just, it was difficult for me pre-pandemic, but at least, again, when you're separating and you leave the door and when you come home, there's that expectation that you're available. If everyone is home and, you know, you're working on a 24/7 basis, if I'm getting a call at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and, you know, my 3-year-old is tugging on my shirt, it's just going to be impossible, you know, for me not to, you know, have to, you know, deal with that balance.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And neither could our attendees at 38% saying work-life balance is the most difficult.
Yes.
And I really, you win. And I really do feel like the work-life balance and maintaining productivity probably go hand in glove. I know for me anyway,
Yeah, they do.
I've been working from home now for over 10 years, and it took me a solid year to not feel guilty about getting up and taking the dog for a walk, or feeling like I was going to miss something, or that the expectation was that I was going to have my butt firmly planted in my chair for between 9 and 5, and that's just really not the reality. So this really isn't too surprising to me. How about you guys?
Well, very similar. I was lucky. I worked for Intel for a long time, and they kind of started a working from home policy way back in the mid-90s. So I've actually been home based. Interesting enough, in a previous role, I was actually given an office in the kind of the headquarter facility in London, and it was a shock to me because I'd never had an office for 30 years, and it was just this very strange experience. And so I'm pleased that I don't have that. But as you say, it does take a level of discipline and kind of thought in terms of setting up an environment at home, but also the discipline of, when are you there, when are you not? When, as you said, when can you do something that you don't feel, guilty? Somehow, going to lunch for an hour when you're in an office is somehow okay, but going to lunch for an hour when you're at home is somehow, I'm kind of not doing what I should be doing.
It only takes 15 minutes to make those frozen meals, so I'm not sure what you'd be spending the hour on.
Well, I have to thaw out those global artichokes first before I can cook them, obviously. So
they're almost right. I can see.
So
they're almost right.
The good news is I got to say artichoke before you did, Phil. So yeah, I'm very happy about that. I think I
actually mentioned it earlier, but I think.
Didn't hear you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, likely stories. That bandwidth. Those dang kids.
There you go.
Look, I think I think there's no question about it. On the flip side of it, when I was going to the office on a daily basis. We have a couple of facilities in New York City. We had an office that was, recently moved, outside of those facilities in New York City. I always felt like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, always rushing to get out of the house because you're trying to get my kids to school and trying to get to the office for a particular meeting, only to get a phone call to say, I was needed at a data center or to meet for a tour or something was in my calendar or whatever. And then always rushing to get home to make sure that, I could have dinner with the kids and as a family and whatnot. And there's some level of just, relaxation, that removal of that burden of being expected to be in different places that I think is, beneficial. Of course, you have to make sure that you're still present and you don't have the benefit of the physical separation to create those demarcation lines. But, for me personally, the idea, I always felt like I was in a rush and in the wrong place at the wrong time. And now I might be in the wrong place, but I'm like feet away from whatever the right place is.
Thanks, guys. So, one of the answers was overcoming technical hurdles. And there's been no question. I mean, obviously the work-life balance, maintaining productivity, very, very, very difficult to do. But overcoming those technical hurdles, I'm not going to lie, I've had technical hurdles. But fortunately for me, so have the other people. And so we're kind of like this one world where we're going, this is annoying, it's frustrating, but I've been there kind of thing. So, and that's really kind of where we're getting with the next poll question. And that question is, has it been a challenge to share bandwidth in your home during the pandemic? Number one, constantly. Sometimes, no, my bandwidth is performing well and not available to my household. If you are answering not available to my household, you are lying. What do you guys think?
I think Phil was about to go with that answer as he's got his own dedicated thing going on.
Well, it's only because I had, it was constantly at first, right? The reason why it took me a month to get my own bandwidth was because I had to kind of convince my wife that I could have the installer come into the house and put him in full PPE in order to get this thing installed. The first person I saw outside of my family was the installer for my second internet line. That was the first. It wasn't my parents. That was the guy that came in, and I put a full, I wrapped him in saran wrap before he came in, which made it really difficult for him to crimp cables and all that. But inevitably, that's where we landed. You
guys, let's turn this question upside down. Actually, what What about those communities, those more traditionally rural communities that may not have the kind of bandwidth that that you have in Brooklyn and that I have in Northwest Indiana even? What about them? What do you imagine the biggest challenges are there, other than just not having a very good?
I mean, look, I think one of the there's two sides of this, right? I think one of the benefits of this new kind of disrupted reality is that people will become comfortable with working from home, and employers will be comfortable with their employees working from home, which will allow people to spread out. But there's no question there'll be an acute issue associated with those communities that just don't have that type of infrastructure. And I think it's incumbent upon, it's probably more, kind of federal government paving the way to make sure that, you can expedite the installation of those lines, because it's always been something that's been, out there and, as part of the zeitgeist, wanting to bring high speed bandwidth to rural communities. Google Fiber had, a huge a push to do that within the last couple of years. And I think it's going to be incumbent upon all sorts of telecom companies, governments, and, a lot of, these new, very powerful corporations like Google and Amazon and Facebook to try to support bringing, bandwidth to the far reaches of the country and the world. And that's where you get into conversations about, 5G and maybe that, you kind of, jump over the traditional infrastructure to a certain extent to get to it.
What do you think,
Perrine?
Yeah, and I think to add to that, we're seeing, for example, mobile operators in many countries now asking and working very closely with federal governments to say, skip the 5G auction process, remove some of the red tape, remove some of the bureaucracy, maybe relax some of the regulations, so that we can go out and start deploying infrastructure. Because I think one thing has certainly happened is the sort of the necessity of the last 5 or so months has kind of driven, this real need, and it's become a need, right? There has been, almost every country has some form of digital transformation strategy that says we want to be, in a smart city type of environment. We want to deploy, infrastructure to, as many households as possible. But to a certain extent, that's kind of been an ambition. It's been a, well, we'll get there over time. I think this has accelerated that whole process. I remember reading an article of a lead developer for one of the relatively big software companies who was used to being in the office and surrounded by every bit of infrastructure that he and his team needed to package up and QA and go through the whole process as far as software development is concerned. He's now at home on actually a very, very poor internet connection. And actually, he couldn't do his job. So he couldn't download the hundreds of megabytes of packages for him to do his QA and test and to, recode or validate, and package back up again. And so in some cases, this has become a sort of a very binary challenge where there are parts of our sort of environment that are simply not conducive for this sort of, working from home environment. So I think we should, take some, I guess take a little bit of time to say, for those of us that live in large cities and in some of the bigger, more affluent countries, a lot of this we take for granted. In large parts of Asia and Africa and Eastern Europe and lots of other places, these things are a long way from, something that you can take for granted. It's a real luxury to have good bandwidth in lots of parts of the world.
And it's not just a matter of, a software developer or an engineer or somebody that's in, maybe the world surrounding us. When people have to go to school from home, it's the difference between being able to, have an education for your children and not. So it's not just an issue for, just the people that happen to be in worlds that require, high bandwidth connectivity. Absolutely. Everybody needs it. And, that ubiquity of it all makes it, probably a more challenging problem to solve just in terms of scope, but also all the more fundamental and all the more, necessary that should, inspire the type of investment that it'll take to make it happen to, you know, the rural parts of the United States and, you know, the parts of the world and Africa and some, you know, rural Asian countries and et cetera, that just, you know, have not had that type of investment in their infrastructure.
For sure, and I definitely want to get to some of those solutions too, guys, when we get further along. But real quick, Amy, there they are. Sometimes almost 60%. That makes complete sense to me. No bandwidth.
Nobody lied.
Nobody lied. However, you know, it did facilitate a very, very good subject, and that is, you know, those pockets of the world where you know, it's simply not available, and how, and the challenges that we face when you know, when my 100 megabit service goes down to 30 megabits. Oh no, what if I didn't have it at all? So to discuss later, but great, thanks guys. That's it for the poll questions for now. But just kind of picking up or piggybacking on some of those poll questions. Questions directly to you, Phillip and Arun. What's been different for you both personally and professionally since the start of the pandemic? We got to some of that earlier when we were talking about the polls, but let's talk a little bit about what we didn't talk about. You even mentioned some of the mental health things, Arun. So whatever you guys want to talk about, let's open that up.
Well, why don't I start with travel?
Great.
So, you know, so kind of doing the, you know, what did sort of normal look like then, whatever that term means now, it means a different thing. And what does it look like now? And would we consider, at any sort of, you know, global scale, if you will, going back to some semblance of what normal looked like then? So I might just kind of tell a little story of a kind of a weird trip that I conducted, I don't know, five or something years ago. So I'm based in the UK, as I said, and I had to travel to Sweden to go see a couple of customers in two different places. And so I kind of tell this story because there's one interesting factlet, which is I found myself in 5 airports in one day, which is, by the way, an experience that I genuinely do not want to repeat ever again. I mean, it was, yeah, but you can see, right, the amount of time where I was sort of doing very little or potentially even nothing, which was just taken up in traveling and waiting in airport lounges and things like that. But the point here is that if I had suggested to those customers that I was not going to travel and that we should do a call instead, well, let me put it a different way. I wouldn't have considered asking the question at the time. It just wasn't an acceptable question to ask in that environment. But the difference now is I'm not even sure we have to ask the question. It's sort of taken as granted that this is a perfectly valid, genuine way of meeting someone, even for the first time, you know, and potentially getting into conversations. And I'll talk a little bit about, you know, kind of the sort of quality of relationships now, I think, compared to before. But the point here is that I had to do that. So I had to fly from London to Copenhagen, you know, get a taxi across the sea to Malmö in the south of Sweden, have my first meeting there, fly to Stockholm, have another meeting there, and then fly to an island just in the Baltic Sea called Gotland, final meeting. 16-hour day, you know, and it was not normal. I didn't do this every day of the week, but it was a relatively routine type of arrangement. Would I consider doing that now? No, I genuinely don't think, you know, unless it's you know, you really have to be there. There is some big ceremony or whatever it is, you just wouldn't do that. The difference now, of course, is that I can do those 3 customer meetings and probably 3 more in the same day, and I could do that repeatedly. So just from a volume of, you know, customer interaction, you know, things are certainly easier in that sense. You can do more and I think on the whole be more productive. But I think it's also reasonable to say that our current way of working isn't a direct replacement for, you know, for face-to-face contact. There are things that don't convey. There are meanings. And by the way, this is especially true for, you know, high context as opposed to high content cultures. You know, if you're dealing with people in Japan, for example, this is actually not a particularly good medium for getting across meaning. because so much of it is sort of contextual when you have face-to-face meetings in Japan, for example, or in Singapore or Hong Kong. So, so we have to all think about, how do we replace and how do we augment, some of those interactions. What is gained? There is certainly, greater opportunity just by virtue of people being more available, to have more interactions. And I'll just make one final point on this. I have got to know much more about my customers and our partners, and specifically their personal lives, in a way that is actually quite routine and very sort of normal now. Whereas going into an office and having a meeting with someone and getting into sort of a longer conversation about, where do you live, how many children do you have, doesn't normally happen. And it's almost sort of cross-cultural in the sense that, a sort of meeting that I might have with lots of people in different European countries, that sort of barrier seems to have dropped. And I think that's a really, really nice thing, because it does create, a sort of a level of individuality to the interactions where, it's not just about sort of two corporate people getting in a room, having a conversation that's kind of, very, very sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, just specific about, a topic. There's a sort of broadness to, to interaction now, which I think is wonderful.
Phillip?
I think the one thing that I'll point out is, when we're doing the prep for this, we talked about that, and I just want to point out that ServerFarm and Arun have such impressive customers that the idea of going from London to Stockholm to Copenhagen and all those places, and it's an incredibly fancy trip, man. Me trying to suggest that me going to Sheboygan and Trenton and the places where you'd find, the typical NYI customer is not nearly as impressive, although the efficiency is exactly the same. So your point is incredibly taken. Look, I think there's no question, just to build on Arun's point, in terms of the relationship, that all of the collective emperors have no clothes, right? So, the idea of, I've always been I don't know if anybody knows this out there about me, I'm a fairly informal guy. So the fact that, the idea of formality has been, toppled, I think is incredibly valuable, because you get so much more done when you strip that veneer of formality. And I think we've all been forced, because we're all experiencing this together, whether you're in Copenhagen or Stockholm or Sheboygan or New York or London, there's this shared experience that I think for the majority of us that have to communicate with customers is gold in terms of establishing a relationship and just speaking about our experiences before we even get into a solution. But I think from the New York standpoint, if we want to focus on how New York is going to be impacted on this, I don't think it's particularly obvious. I think there's a general feeling that I have that the nature of commercial office space, the nature of offices in general, and there actually have been some fairly large leases signed in New York over the last couple of weeks, which is might be surprising, but I think overall obviously it's impacted. What people are going to look to offices to become are these kind of collaboration places where they come in to the office. New York still has that feeling, that vibrance. So it's still going to be a place, I think, where people want to maintain their headquarters. And obviously we have an incredible amount of infrastructure here. So I just think there's going to be this transition to collaborative environment. People are coming to the office for a specific reason in order to collaborate with their colleagues far less regularly than they were, just because of the efficiency. And I think, some of these points speak to that. And for, the impact that employers, I mean, I can only imagine, on top of Arun's, benefit just mentally from not having to travel all that much, as fancy as it sounded, to ServerFarm for not having to pay for all that travel. I mean, the amount of money saved and the ability for, that money, hopefully for, companies that are doing it right, to be reinvested in a way that facilitates the mental health of their staff and makes their environment much more conducive to productive work. I think is going to be incredibly valuable. I think that, you know, there are plenty of companies out there that will not take that opportunity, but I think the majority of companies that successfully navigate this new disrupted reality, they will look to this as an opportunity to prioritize, you know, how they're spending their money and hopefully invest in their workforce to make their lives better.
Awesome, great stuff there, you guys. But Phillip, you mentioned infrastructure not more than a minute ago. Let's go there. Let's talk a little bit about infrastructure. You both are representing data center companies, so why don't you give our viewers, the registrants, kind of a take on what the impact of the coronavirus has had on the internet infrastructure over the last, say, 5 or 6 months.
You know, I think I think in general I think there's a I think the guys at Cloudflare put this out, like the internet was built for this. You know, this is the kind of thing where, you know, had we had this type of pandemic 10 years ago, 15 years ago, maybe even shorter than that, less than that, it would be an incredibly more disruptive. Like there would be no opportunity to pivot in the way that we've pivoted today, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have, you know, built this underlying infrastructure and to a certain extent overbuilt it, both from a networking standpoint and a power standpoint, with the ability to kind of seamlessly expand for our customers that have had to, you know, focus more of their efforts on their kind of virtual environment. So from that standpoint of it, I think, you know, the internet has not only proven crucial, but is just more obvious to people that might not have even understood that this underlying critical infrastructure was there supporting it. You know, just kind of understanding, you know, how it works, but not why it works. And I think it's become more clear in why it works anytime there's a blip. On the flip side of that, in terms of, you know, how we've had to pivot from an operational standpoint, there are a couple of interesting things. You know, we've had to shift the way we staff the facilities to make sure that you don't have, you know, as much overlap in staff. And that might mean, you know, have people rotate in and be able to monitor things that they can monitor from home and don't necessarily physically need to be there. And just, you know, we almost have our own internal business continuity that's had to be engaged to be able to support people that are on site without, you know, creating, you know, a difficult environment for them, given the you know, the health concerns. So there's that, and there's also us trying to, you know, focus more of our efforts in assisting our customers in doing things physically that they would otherwise have had to, you know, come to the facility for. And some of that really has to do not just with offering those services, but trying to coach our customers in how to explain the things that they need. And I think that type of communication ability and guiding people to how to describe things within a data center environment that, you know, they're not particularly comfortable describing. I don't know if the people that are listening to this thing have met a lot of people that work in and around critical infrastructure, particularly on the operations side, but communication was not necessarily like the peak characteristic that you would think of, and you know, maintaining computers and whatnot. So to trying to make them comfortable with explaining, you know, the items that they need and giving us the trust to be able to do some of those things to keep them safe and to keep our team safe has been, you know, and made for an interesting several months.
Arun?
I want to pick a couple of sort of recognition things. You know, so two things that kind of fall into the recognition bucket. So I've been in the mixture of the IT and the data center industry since 1987. I started at IBM, long time at Intel, and I have spent all of that time, 30 whatever years, figuring out how do I tell people what I do? Because if I say I'm in IT, they kind of go, oh, really? You know, so if I say I'm in banking, people go, oh, get it. You know, I'm an architect. Great, understand. I'm an engineer, get it. I'm an IT guy. Ooh, what does that mean? And by the way, data centers are not very far away from that. You know, so I work for a data center company. I might explain to someone that I meet and they just go, what is that? And so rather than this sort of long conversation, I used to figure out, well, there's probably a different way of describing what I do. And let me just say that I work in telecommunications, and people go, oh, great, got it. That has changed. You know, people have suddenly, for a couple of reasons. They have been beneficiaries of, you know, some absolute heroism on the part of IT people. The reason we're all able to do what we do now is because the IT industry en masse has figured out how to make that pivot very, very quickly, you know, and to do things and to create network capacity, to create VPN infrastructure, to create remote working, you know, with all of the sort of security that most companies need. They've been able to do that almost overnight. And I think we should take some time to applaud the IT people who, to all intents and purposes, are the sort of hidden, you know, they're the hidden people behind critical infrastructure. Nobody knows them. People only know IT people when something goes wrong. And the same is true now for data centers. I think people have started to recognize that data centers are actually quite a big thing, and they are a hugely important part of not just digital infrastructure, but the internet infrastructure. You know, the internet is kind of two pieces, right? It's a network bit and it's a data center bit, and you need both of those things to come together in, you know, in a great way, you know, to be able to do that. So that's kind of one bit of recognition where people now have a much better appreciation and understanding of what this part of, you know, the world does. The other part is most enterprises have also come to the conclusion, if they haven't already, that running physical infrastructure is actually painful. It's complicated. It's not the core business of most people. And I think what we're seeing, I think all of us are seeing, is, you know, a much more kind of accelerated focus to, you know, let's take our infrastructure and let's bring in the right partners. And whether we move our physical infrastructure or bring partners in to come and run it for us, let's bring in these experts, because we don't want to test our environment in either the people bit or the technology bit in the same way again. And I think we're all here because we've come to the conclusion, rightly so, we're not going to go back to how it was six months ago, right? So we're not going to wait another, let's say, 6 months, wait for it to all die down, and then just congregate back in offices and work in exactly the way we were. So I think those two bits of recognition are really, really important. Is, you know, a recognition that IT and data center people occupy a very, very important part of our society today. And this whole move to digital transformation, of which cloud is one part, is really something that has now become an imperative. If it wasn't already, it is absolutely an imperative. Every single one of our customers is saying, tell me, please, how do I do this? Can you make this pain go away? And I think that's really what Phil and I and our teams do. That's, you know, we help customers solve those problems. And I think, you know, just the ability for this part of our world to be flexible, which is absolutely what it's demonstrated in the last 4 or 5 months, it is a lot of hard work on the part of lots of people. So this isn't someone just sort of, oh, let me run that DR program that we've kept in our vault for 3 years just for this thing. Everybody was figuring out stuff from first principles in some cases. But I mean, it's just absolute heroism to, you know, to get this all done.
So if somebody asked you 2 weeks from now what you do, would you go back to saying I'm in IT?
No, I'll probably just say I'm a collector of artichokes or something.
Clearly. It's
I feel like we probably should have scheduled 4 hours for this, but unfortunately we only have the hour. We've got 15 minutes left. We've got some questions coming in and still yet some polls to take. So quickly, by the way, Arun, my mother still thinks that I work in computers, and I've been doing the same job for the last 20 years in PR and marketing. So there you go. But kind of relevant to the existing conversation right now, we did get a question that came in. So Amy, before I jump into this poll, I want to get this other question answered if that's okay. Phillip, if you wouldn't mind, the question is, do you see a need for outsourcing services like remote hands, field engineers, etc.?
The answer is of course. I mean, it goes hand in hand with what I just described in terms of, you know, people needing to come up with ways to manage their infrastructure, just like Arun said, that are not, you know, the traditional, you know, let's send one of our guys to a data center to mount something. So I do think the biggest challenge with that is, like I said earlier, is trying to figure out the best mechanism with which to describe what's needed, because the people that tended to be the ones that went to the environment are usually the ones that are the worst at describing, you know, what they need, because they just do it. And, I've fallen into that trap as well with things, in my world that are specific to me. Everyone's got, that kind of 57 Chevy feel to their own environment. And it's kind of difficult to describe it because you don't want to necessarily, suggest that you might have a vulnerability or that something isn't exactly, right. But at the same time, you need the benefit of remote hands. So being like a kind of non-judgmental and communication enabled, those remote hands capabilities are incredibly important.
Arun?
Yeah, I would add to that, and I'd agree with it, and Phil and I both sort of touched on that topic. I'd maybe take it a little step further back into the customer organization, and that is to say that in addition to that, let's go visit the facility where we have something to do whatever work is required. I think people are taking the opportunity to trust their data center partners with things that are much higher up the stack than they would previously have suggested. So they're now saying, well, can you help me with migration projects? Can you help me with my capacity management? Because I think all of this has exposed that there are vulnerabilities, and they might not be security vulnerabilities, but maybe vulnerabilities from an efficiency perspective, or a true understanding of the sort of true nature of the asset base that a customer has. And I think, as I said, if anything has kind of accelerated, just the necessity of having to do something, I think has spurred people into action, where previously this might have been, well, we have 100 things going on a day-to-day basis. We'll get to that. We'll probably get to that next year. I think people are just sort of leapfrogging that and saying, actually, let me just do that now, because it's good for everyone. Everybody gets something out of this. Our partners win, we become more efficient, we become more reliable. And I think, so this concept of customers and data center companies coming together, in their sort of own little ecosystems, I think is incredibly powerful. And I don't think can be replaced. Again, I don't think anyone's going to go, well, this was great for 6 months. Now let's just go back to, it's like saying, well, let's take away Wi-Fi from everyone. Life would be very different and probably quite painful for almost everyone.
I have a wire and I'm the only one. I think one other point is this notion that we used to use kind of on the sales side to try to suggest that we're not just doing, the hard sales mechanism of referring to ourselves as partners versus vendors. I think is only become more true. I mean, what we've always kind of marketed ourselves similar to the way ServerFarm has marketed themselves as kind of an extension of our customers' teams. And, that type of accessibility, the filling of capabilities gaps, et cetera, is only acutely more important now than it was 5 months ago. So I think other companies are, that we're more commodity driven will try to, kind of enhance their ecosystems to come alongside that. But it's kind of difficult to replicate from if someone is just kind of a real estate technology company to have the type of accountability and up the stack support as you would having those types of resources under one roof.
Excellent. Thanks, gentlemen. In the interest of time, I'm going to challenge us to do a little bit of speed dating in the last 10 minutes here. We've got a couple of polls. The first one is what's been your company? There it is. Thank you. What's been your company's biggest challenge throughout the pandemic? Network security, maintaining productivity, meeting sales goals. I got a feeling that's going to be our big winner there, and other. So that's number one. And Amy, if you wouldn't mind, can we go to the second poll and then get to the, no, I can't. Okay, that's fine. So gentlemen, what are your thoughts here? Biggest challenges throughout the pandemic: network security, maintaining productivity, meeting sales goals. What do you guys think?
I'll jump in with meeting sales goals. Has always been a difficult one. Frankly, it was a difficult one pre-pandemic for any data center provider, and it continues to be a difficult one as people kind of, are determining how they're going to leverage infrastructure and what they're going to do. And, to the extent that a significant amount of sales previously were related to changes in infrastructure and, unseating incumbent providers and things like that, this has kind of slowed down that trajectory almost to a grinding halt. So initiatives that might have been in place before, you know, Q2 moved to Q3, from Q3 moved to Q4. And I think, you know, we're probably into, you know, Q2 2021 before those initiatives start growing, because people are kind of bandaging their environments more than they are, you know, doing massive overhauls.
What do you think, Arun?
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that, and actually add a little bit of kind of extra color in the sense that so let me say, so companies like ServerFarm and NYI, the good data center companies in this market. I don't want to talk about the great unwashed, but the point is that for the last 5 months, we have been on the most amazing marketing campaign of all time, because we've responded to our customers saying, "Can you do this? Can you do this now? Can you do this for me in an hour?" And, you know, almost without exception, we've said, yeah, absolutely. And we have done that. And so we've built, you know, our customers love us. They trust us with, you know, the crown jewels of their infrastructure. And they've just, we've probably fallen in love with our customers and they with us, you know, even more in the last 5 months. And they've just said to us, you guys, you're more than just an extension to our business. You're more than just this extra little bit that sits on the outside. You're part of the family. And again, that is something that is almost impossible to go back on. So I think our ability as IT people, as data center people, to rise to the challenge and help our customers in, you know, the most tough times. I mean, we built a new data center in Toronto, you know, 40 megawatts of capacity, and we did it on time, despite everything that's going on. And I think those things are testament to, you know, how nimble we actually are as an industry, and maybe something that we haven't really managed to convey particularly well in the past. But certainly our customers, I know NYI customers, you know, they've really felt that experience. They've seen us rise to the challenge, and, you know, and we don't go complaining and saying, "Oh, you're giving us too much. It's very complicated. We can't do it." We just do it. That's what we do.
I think you need to define speed dating, Dean.
Yeah, because I feel like we're on our honeymoon already, Arun. Thank you. Okay, and as luck would have it, look, meeting sales goals 61%, other being 28. If you were one of the other people, ask a question about something, and I promise, if you ask a question about this poll as that 28%, we will get to that. I'm going to move on to the next poll question, if you guys are cool with that. Good. How has your company's digital transformation timeline shifted during the pandemic? Number one, not at all, accelerated by less than a year, accelerated by more than a year, and other. Guys, any thoughts here?
Accelerated, everyone. It doesn't necessarily matter whether they've even employed additional infrastructure or not. You might not think of it in terms of whether you've, you know, accelerated a specific portion of your own digital transformation, but if you're largely using Zoom for your meetings versus having in-person meetings, you have accelerated your digital transformation. You are not going back to the same level of you know, in-person meetings as you were prior to, and that's both in terms of travel and going to the office and et cetera. So, you know, I think, you know, some companies were more well-positioned than others. I think, you know, data center companies in general, obviously, you know, eat our own dog food. So, you know, we have the ability to, you know, leverage a lot of, you know, virtual capabilities, but I think every company has had to accelerate in one way or another, and some obviously more than others.
What do you think, Arun?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything to add, you know, to what Phil said, other than to say, you know, our job again as an industry is just to continue to be there, because, you know, we are ultimately the recipients of the end product of what digital transformation looks like for our customers, and it's our job just to make that transition as easy as possible, as efficient as possible, as reliable as possible, which is what we do, right? That's what we do. That's what NYI does. That's the reason why we're here.
Excellent. Amy, what'd the registrants say? There it is. Wow, accelerated by less than a year, accelerated by more than a year, a tie. Not at all at 29%. Interesting. Okay, guys, in the interest of time, I'm just going to move forward. This is where we, let's challenge ourselves to each give a 1-minute answer to the next 3 questions, if possible. And so Phillip, we're going to start with you. In your work with your enterprise customers, what concerns are you seeing around their IT environments?
Okay, set the timer. Okay, I think the primary concern is that they can, augment their environments and keep pace with their increased reliance on how they're leveraging those environments, given the limitations that they have based on physical deployments and all that stuff, and potentially logistics around purchasing servers and equipment and all of those things. Because this was such a, how much time do I have left? Because it was such a ubiquitous, I can speak fast, because it was such a ubiquitous, kind of pandemic that crossed the entire world, supply timelines when it comes to fiber infrastructure that primarily is sourced out of, China and some, hard drives and things that are sourced out of Southeast Asia, in many cases, have impacted their ability to grow their environments. So, to the extent that we can help and assist and supplement with, cloud capabilities and whatnot, that's, offering that type of flexibility and seamless expansion is what brought us to the dance.
Arun, same question. Enterprise customer.
Almost exactly the same answer, in the sense that most enterprise ICs went through that real kind of, squeezing of the supply chain, especially in the early days, sort of March, April, May, where they had to buy more equipment to enable, much more distributed workforce, couldn't get things. And I think they've all, again, if they hadn't already, they've all come to the same conclusion, is they just don't want to be in that world. They don't want to be in the world where they're having to procure their own infrastructure, manage their own infrastructure, house their own infrastructure. And again, as I said, we've done a really good job proving to them that this new world of having your infrastructure, well looked after, well maintained, run more efficiently, run more reliably by a good data center, a good IT operations company, it's a real thing. It's no longer a, well, if I do that, it might work. It's just clear. It's clearer than night or day.
It sounds better in that accent, doesn't it? Everything sounds better in that accent. There's nothing I can say.
It's true, Phillip. Arun, we're going to stick with you. Next question. How can enterprises become more agile from an IT perspective to be ready for any crisis moving forward? You have 1 minute.
And I think we touched on it almost through the last sort of 58 minutes or so. One thing I'll mention is I think one very, very clear view in the market is that everybody is going to live in some kind of hybrid world. There is no everything in cloud, everything in an old building. The reality is, for quite some time to come, the next 7 to 10 years, is people need to live in a hybrid world. And that means that they can depend very, very well on the big guys that are providing cloud services, but they need to have a similar experience in terms of it being a cloud-like experience, for all of their non-cloud workloads. And that's really what, again, from a data center perspective, that's what we do. That's what our job is. Our job isn't to be real estate people owning buildings. Those days are long gone. There are some people still stuck in those days, frankly. Our job is really to make people's physical infrastructure agile, and that's, again, as I said, we've spent the last 5 months really demonstrating how real that actually is.
Phillip, anything to add?
Having the New York twang come after that is just not appropriate. It's a similar answer and much less artfully spoken, because I don't speak in iambic pentameter like Arun does. But not being beholden to singular technologies, not being tied to something that is not agile is the best advice we can give anyone. And that's not to say because we want to incorporate data center into public cloud workloads and private cloud workloads. It's just the nature of being able to deploy something if something else isn't otherwise available. So having that agility between different types of infrastructure is incredibly important. And I think to a certain extent, if you deploy a workload in the public cloud because it's available, even if it's not necessarily the most cost effective or performance effective, having that type of hybrid model and the ability to then migrate that workload over time to a private cloud or more traditional data center environment, while having the ability to control it all with a single pane of glass or a similar experience as possible, is no doubt the way companies are going to see the future.
All right, Phillip, staying with you. We are over time, but I got to get to this question. Let's just try to keep it super brief. How do you feel like business operations will shift permanently because of the crisis?
Look, I think we touched on this also. There's just no question that for the companies that were not necessarily comfortable with people working from home or working from anywhere, I think those days are over. I think the idea of people coming into the office in the more traditional way is gone, and the office environment, like I suggested when those slides were up earlier, is going to become a more collaborative environment if it even exists. And just there, you know, to have catch-ups on a quarterly basis, or, you know, for small subsections of employees that just need, for some reason, to physically interact, and almost more of a, from a cultural perspective, more than a business, you know, requirement. And that's going to significantly shift how people spend their dollars. And I think the, you know, priorities on travel and business travel and all that, like we touched on earlier, are going to shift the way companies invest in both space and travel and entertainment to a certain extent.
Awesome. Arun, final word.
The pandemic didn't really make us do things differently. It just made us do things that we would have done much further in the future and do them now. I mean, the reality, nobody is going to do something or is doing something that wasn't already envisaged. It was just further out in terms of time. Most of the big tech companies, as most of us have seen, have already said to their employees, you can work from home permanently. Just the whole come to the office thing. But, you know, I saw yesterday, even companies like Siemens. I mean, Siemens is more than 100 years old. They just announced that they would let all of their, you know, employees work from home on a permanent basis as well. So I think we've simply made things happen today that we probably were going to do next year, the year after. So this isn't a, well, we kind of went down that fork, now let's go back to the fork and go the other way. Oh, this is it. This is just how life is going to be from now on. There's no going back. And I think that, by the way, is a very, very good thing on the whole.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Gentlemen, we did it. We're just a few minutes over. I cannot thank you enough for taking the time and kind of talking through these things, both personally and professionally. An amazing conversation. I think there's a lot of things we could have really unpacked with a little bit of time. So maybe we should do this again. So thanks again, we really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks for making me put on a button-down shirt for the first time in 5 months.
Amy, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you, viewers, for attending today's virtual event. We hope that you enjoyed the banter. I know I definitely did. And, you know, again, your attendance today really helped support 2 nonprofit organizations, Empower and Young Women's Trust. So thank you for being here to support those organizations. Again, thank you, Arun and Phil, for sharing your expertise and insights. And of course, thank you, Dean, for driving this conversation for us. Thank you again for joining us, and stay safe and be well.